She had nothing left to lose. That was the only reason Claire Whitmore did what she did that night. Walked into the most dangerous room in Seoul, looked a crime lord dead in the eyes, and slapped him across the face in front of 50 witnesses who all stopped breathing at the same time. Nobody slaps Kang Seojin. Nobody even raises their voice near him. And yet, he smiled. That smile would change everything. If you've ever been broke, alone, and so desperate you'd shake hands with the devil himself, this story is for you. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The flight from Los Angeles to Seoul had taken 14 hours, and Claire Whitmore spent most of it sitting rigid in a middle seat between a snoring businessman and a toddler who kicked the tray table with the rhythm of someone who genuinely hated her. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She had $32 in her checking account, a carry-on with 4 changes of clothes, and a name scrawled on a cocktail napkin. The contact number of a restaurant owner in Itaewon who'd promised her a waitressing job through a mutual friend back home. That friend had also promised her the job paid well, that Seoul was easy to navigate, and that she'd love it out there. That friend had never actually been to Korea. Claire pressed her forehead against the cold oval window somewhere over the Pacific and watched the black water 30,000 feet below and thought about her mother. Dorothy Whitmore, 61 years old, bad hip, worse lungs, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Bakersfield, California, on a fixed income that barely covered the electricity bill. Claire sent money home every month. That was the arrangement. That was the whole reason she was here, packed into a flying metal tube hurtling toward a country where she didn't speak the language and knew exactly one person. And that person's English stopped at hello and thank you. She told herself it was fine. She had survived worse. She didn't entirely believe that, but she told herself anyway. Seoul hit her like a wall. Not an unpleasant wall, just a solid, overwhelming, unmistakable wall of noise and neon and people moving at a pace that suggested everyone had somewhere important to be in the next 4 minutes. The subway from Incheon was packed even at 11 at night. Claire stood with her carry-on wedged between her knees and a reflection staring back at her from the dark tunnel glass. Pale, exhausted, brown hair pulled into a knot that had given up trying to be a bun somewhere over Japan. She looked like what she was. A woman who had been running from one bad situation and hadn't yet confirmed whether the next one was better. The apartment her new employer had arranged for her was on the 5th floor of a building in Mapo-gu with no elevator and a shower that provided hot water for exactly 7 minutes before turning cold without warning. The refrigerator hummed like it was in physical pain. The single window looked directly into the concrete wall of the building next door. Claire set her bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and did not cry. She had a rule about crying in new places. You had to wait at least 48 hours before you were allowed to assess whether the situation was actually bad or just unfamiliar. Most situations, in her experience, were just unfamiliar. She pulled out the cocktail napkin, confirmed the restaurant name, Hwanso Grill, Itaewon-dong, and set her phone alarm for 7 in the morning. Then she lay back on the flat pillow and stared at the ceiling until her eyes closed on their own. The restaurant was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Deliberately, carefully, with nothing left to accident. Dark wood paneling, recessed lighting that turned every customer's face warm and significant, individual grills built flush into each table so the smoke rose in thin, clean columns toward discrete ventilation systems hidden in the ceiling. The smell was extraordinary. Charcoal and sesame and something deeply savory that Claire couldn't name but that made her stomach clench with hunger on her very first walk through the dining room. Park Jun-ho, the manager, was a compact man in his 40s with a voice like gravel and an expression that communicated approximately zero tolerance for incompetence. He walked her through the floor plan in Korean first, then, when she stared at him blankly, switched to English that was clipped and efficient and entirely functional. You carry dishes. You explain cuts of meat. I give you card. You read it until you know it. You don't know it, you read it more. Customer asks something you don't understand, you come to me. You don't guess. He stopped and looked at her with the specific intensity of someone who had been let down by guessing before. You understand? I understand, Claire said. You are American. Yes. You have worked restaurant before? 8 years. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not to warmth exactly, but to a marginally less hostile neutral. Okay. Friday's busy. Tonight you watch. You start tomorrow. She started tomorrow. Within 3 weeks, she had memorized every cut on the menu, could carry 4 cast iron plates simultaneously without flinching, and had learned enough Korean to greet customers, apologize for delays, and ask whether they preferred their banchan served before or with the main course. She learned fast because she had to. The tips were decent. The work was hard. Her feet hurt in a constant, low-grade, deeply personal way that she had stopped noticing because noticing it didn't change anything. She called her mother on Sunday evenings. Dorothy asked how it was going. Claire said fine. Dorothy said she'd gotten a letter from the insurance company about a medication not being covered. Claire said she'd handle it. Dorothy said she didn't want to be a burden. Claire said she wasn't. They both knew how that exchange worked, and they played their parts without resentment, because love sometimes looks like two people agreeing not to say what they're actually thinking. Claire sent $400 home that first month. It wasn't enough, and they both knew that too. It was a Thursday in late October when everything broke open. The dinner rush had been relentless. 2 large tables of corporate clients, a private birthday party in the back room, and a walk-in group of 8 who'd decided collectively that this was the night they wanted to experience premium Korean barbecue. Claire had been on the floor for 6 hours straight without sitting down. Her water glass was still in the back kitchen where she'd set it down to answer a question and never retrieved it. Her lower back had graduated from aching to something that felt like a personal insult. She was carrying a tray of fresh beef cuts to table 7 when she saw the man. He'd come in without a reservation. She knew that because Park Joon-ho's entire demeanor had shifted the moment he appeared in the doorway. A subtle, almost animal recalibration, like every muscle in the man's body had received a memo simultaneously. The host had materialized from nowhere, bowing at a depth Claire had never actually witnessed before in the 3 weeks she'd been working here. The couple already seated at the best corner table, the one with the best ventilation, the best sightlines, the most privacy, had been quietly, apologetically relocated without being given an opportunity to refuse. The man took the corner table like it had always belonged to him, because, Claire would later understand, it had. He was not what she expected from someone who commanded that level of immediate deference. She'd half anticipated something theatrical, bulk, aggression, the performative menace of someone who needed you to know they were dangerous. Kang So-jin was none of those things. He was perhaps 38, lean in the particular way of someone who moved deliberately through the world and wasted nothing. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have worn expensive things long enough to stop noticing them. His face was composed with an almost architectural stillness. He sat, placed his phone face down on the table, and looked at the menu as though he had all the time in the world, which Claire supposed a man like him did. She didn't know who he was. That was the thing. She genuinely, completely didn't know. The other waitstaff did. She could tell by the way they suddenly became very interested in the tables farthest from that corner. By the way, even Park Joon-ho, the man who had looked through her on day 1 like she was a piece of furniture that hadn't been properly assembled, was moving around the edge of the room with the careful peripheral attention of someone who wanted to be available without being intrusive. Claire picked up her tray and went to table 7. It was the man at the adjacent table who started it. He was drunk. Not dramatically, not belligerently. The quiet, overconfident drunk. The kind that doesn't know it's being loud. He was with 3 other men, all in suits, and somewhere in the course of the evening he had decided that Claire's presence near his table was an open invitation. He'd called her over twice for things he could have managed himself. The third time, as she reached across the table to collect an empty platter, his hand closed around her wrist. Not a grab. Not violent. Just a hand closing around her wrist with the casual ownership of someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered to him. She stopped. The table went quiet. She looked at his hand, then at him. Her voice came out flat and extremely clear. "Let go!" He laughed, said something in Korean that she didn't fully catch but that made his companions look uncomfortable. His grip didn't loosen. "I said let go." She didn't raise her voice, Raising your voice in a place like this was the wrong move. She understood that instinctively. You didn't escalate, you stayed level. You made it simple. He tugged her wrist, not hard, just a little, a demonstration, and said something else, and this time she caught it. She'd been in Seoul long enough. The words were not complicated. They were the kind of words men use when they've decided a woman is something other than a person. She pulled her wrist free. He reached again, and Claire Whitmore, 3 months behind on her mother's medication bills, 6,000 miles from anyone who knew her name, operating on 4 hours of sleep and 6 hours of aching feet and approximately 0 reserve patience, Claire Whitmore picked up the small ceramic dish of doenjang sauce from his table, turned, and walked directly to the corner table. She hadn't planned it. She couldn't explain it even to herself in the moment. But something in the way the room had been arranged all evening, the invisible force field around that corner, the way everyone moved around this particular man like he was a fixed point in the universe, something in her had decided that this was the person she needed to be standing next to when she said what she was about to say. She stopped at the edge of his table. Kang So-jin looked up from his menu. The restaurant had the quality of silence that happens when 50 people simultaneously stop chewing. "The man at that table, shut," she started. And then the drunk man's hand landed on her shoulder from behind. She turned, and her right hand still holding the dish, she set it down first. She was professional even now, even in this. Her right hand came up and connected with the drunk man's face in a slap that was loud enough that the ventilation system sounded enormous by comparison. The silence afterward was total. The drunk man stared at her with the particular expression of someone whose brain is still processing an event his body has already experienced. His cheek was going red. The entire restaurant, all 50-some witnesses, did not move. And Claire, breathing hard now, her heart hammering with the specific terror of someone who has just done something that cannot be undone, became aware that she was standing approximately 3 feet from Kang Seo-jin's table. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her, not with anger, not with the cold calculation of someone already planning consequences. He was looking at her with something she couldn't name, something that sat closer to curiosity than anything else, filtered through an expression so controlled it was almost not an expression at all. He tilted his head slightly. "You're still holding the sauce dish." She looked down. She was, in fact, still gripping the ceramic dish in her left hand. She set it on his table. He looked at it, then back at her. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working." "Sit down," he said again in the same tone. Quiet, level, entirely without threat in a way that was somehow more threatening than threat would have been. She didn't sit, but she didn't walk away either. Park Joon-ho had materialized somewhere behind her left shoulder with the energy of a man standing in front of a controlled explosion and trying to calculate the blast radius. The drunk man at the adjacent table was being very quietly, very efficiently assisted toward the exit by 2 men who had appeared from somewhere Claire hadn't noticed. She hadn't even seen them come in, but they were there, moving with purpose, and the drunk man was not resisting. "Your name," So-jin said. She looked at him. Her breathing had steadied, but her pulse hadn't. "You first." Something crossed his face. It was gone before she could read it properly. Kang Seo-jin. The name meant nothing to her. She saw Park Joon-ho close his eyes for a fraction of a second. She filed that away. "Claire Whitmore," she said. "I'm American. I can tell. Is that a problem?" He considered her. Not in the way people usually considered her, assessing her as a problem, a complication, something to be managed. He considered her the way you consider something genuinely unexpected, something that doesn't fit the pattern of the room you've been sitting in all your life. "No," he said. "It's interesting." Park Joon-ho's hand closed around Claire's elbow from behind, gentle but absolutely non-negotiable. "Miss Whitmore, I need to speak with you in the back." "She's fine," So-jin said, not looking at Joon-ho, still looking at Claire. "Bring her a chair." The chair materialized. Park Joon-ho disappeared. Claire stood for a moment looking at the chair, and then at the man across the table, who waited with the patience of someone who had never needed to repeat himself twice in his life, and was finding the experience of waiting not unpleasant. She sat. He didn't ask her about the slap. He didn't mention the drunk man. He ordered food, enough for 2 people, she noticed, without asking. And he asked her questions in a tone so unremarkable that it took her 3 exchanges to realize she was actually answering them. How long had she been in Seoul? What brought her here? Did she speak Korean? Enough, she said. I'm learning. Why? He poured water for both of them. The gesture was so ordinary that it disoriented her slightly. Because I live here now. It seems like the respectful thing. He looked at that, like it was a physical object he was examining. Most foreign workers don't bother. I noticed. Does that frustrate you? Yes, she said, before she thought about whether to say it. But I can only control what I do. He ate with the efficiency of someone to whom meals are functional, not ceremonial. She ate because she hadn't had dinner, and the galbi he'd ordered was extraordinary, and she was not going to refuse food out of some performance of dignity. She ate, and she didn't look at him constantly, and she didn't try to fill the silence with pleasantries, because something told her that pleasantries would be the wrong move with this man. Silence wasn't uncomfortable for him. It was just baseline. You're not afraid of me, he said. Statement, not question. I don't know who you are, she said. Should I be? He was quiet for a moment, then, most people who don't know who I am still sense it. I'm tired, she said. I've been on my feet for 6 hours. I'm a little past the sensing things phase of the evening. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she would think about for a long time afterward. He laughed. Not a big laugh, not theatrical, just a short, genuine exhale of something like genuine surprise. Like a window had opened in a room that didn't normally have one. It lasted 2 seconds. Then it was gone, and his face returned to its composed default, and he was watching her again with that quality of total attention that she was starting to understand was not typical for him either. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a card, set it on the table between them. She looked at it but didn't pick it up. Plain matte paper, black type, just a number. I have a proposition, he said. I'm going to stop you right there. It is not that kind of proposition. His voice was flat, not offended, just correcting a factual error. I need a woman to attend a family dinner with me. Someone who will not pretend to be something she is not. Someone who is... He seemed to search for the word, not because he didn't have it, but because he was selecting the precise one. Unperformable. She stared at him. That's not a word. It should be. He nodded toward the card. The amount is on the back. She reached forward, picked it up, turned it over. She put it back down, then picked it up again and looked at it a second time to make sure she'd read the number correctly. She had. The number was enough to clear her mother's medical debt, cover 6 months of medication, and put 3 months of rent in reserve. One dinner? He said. She turned the card over again. The number stayed the same. Her heart was doing something complicated. Why me? She said. Because you slapped a man in my restaurant and then sat down and ate dinner without apologizing for either thing. He considered her. My family has spent 20 years presenting women to me who perform whatever they think I want. I need someone who cannot perform, who simply... He paused again. Is. I'm a waitress from Bakersfield, she said. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. She looked at the card. She thought about Dorothy's voice on Sunday evenings, careful and quiet, trying not to ask for more than she already cost. She thought about the apartment in Mapogu with the 7-minute shower. She thought about the way this man's bodyguards had materialized from nowhere to remove a problem, efficient and invisible, like the removal of inconvenient things was simply a service provided by the atmosphere around him. She thought about what kind of man needed bodyguards that operated that way. She put the card in her apron pocket. I'll need to know what I'm walking into, she said. Of course. Full details, no surprises. I'll have someone contact you tomorrow. She stood, straightened her apron, looked at him one more time. He was watching her with that same quality of attention, the kind that didn't demand anything, just registered everything. For what it's worth, she said, you should probably know I'm a terrible liar. I know, he said. That's the point. She nodded once, turned, and walked back across the restaurant floor. Every eye in the room tracked her, and she felt them, and she kept her spine straight and her pace steady, and she didn't look back. Park Junho intercepted her at the kitchen door. His face was the color of old paper. "Miss Whitmore," he started. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry about the scene." "Do you understand who that man is?" She turned to look at him. His expression told her that the answer, whatever it was not small. "Tell me," she said. And even as Park Junho began speaking in a low, urgent voice that she had to lean close to hear over the kitchen noise, even as the words organized themselves into a picture she had not been prepared for. The name, the family, the particular category of power that didn't show up in newspapers or courtrooms, but that everyone in this city understood. Even then, her hand was already in her apron pocket, fingers closed around the card. She was already thinking about the number on the back. She was already calculating what one dinner could cost her versus what it could save. She didn't know yet that the answer to that question was not a number. It was not a number at all. Park Junho didn't stop talking for 4 minutes straight. Claire stood in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the dry storage room and listened to all of it with her back against the wall and her arms crossed, and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing information that required a fundamental rearrangement of her assumptions about a situation. Kang Seo-jin, 39 years old. Third-generation head of the Kang family enterprise, which was the kind of phrase that sounded clean and corporate until you understood what the enterprise actually comprised. Import logistics, construction contracts, private security, all of it legitimate on paper. All of it existing alongside a separate architecture of influence and enforcement that the Seoul Metropolitan Police had been attempting to document for the better part of a decade without producing a single charge that stuck. Not because they were incompetent, because the Kang family operated at an altitude where charges required cooperation, and cooperation required someone willing to testify, and no one had ever been willing. "He has never been arrested," Park Junho said, in the tone of someone describing a force of nature. "Not once, not questioned. The people who have tried—" He stopped, looked at her carefully. "You sat at his table." "He invited me." "Miss Whitmore." Junho looked genuinely pained. "He does not invite people." "He invited me." The pain in Junho's expression deepened. "Whatever he said to you tonight, whatever he offered, you should consider very carefully whether—" "I appreciate the concern," she said. "I do, but I need to finish my shift." She pushed off the wall and went back to the floor, and she worked the next 2 hours with mechanical efficiency, carrying plates and clearing tables and smiling at customers in a way that communicated competence without inviting conversation, and she did not look at the corner table again. She didn't need to. She knew when it emptied because the particular quality of the room's tension shifted, the way air pressure changes before a storm system moves on. When she finally clocked out at midnight and stepped into the October cold of Itaewon, there was a black car idling at the curb directly in front of the restaurant entrance, not a taxi. The driver did not look at her. A man in a dark jacket was standing on the sidewalk 4 feet from the door, and when she appeared, he took a single step toward her and offered a small white envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a phone number, a date 3 weeks from now, a time, and 2 words written in English in a precise, unhurried hand, "Be ready." Beneath that, in smaller print, "Someone will call tomorrow. Answer." She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and read it twice and then put it in her pocket next to the card and walked to the subway and went home and lay on her narrow bed in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. The call came at 9 the next morning. A woman's voice, calm and professional, English precise and unaccented, in the particular way of someone who had learned it from formal instruction rather than immersion. Her name was Ms. O. She worked for Mr. Kang's private office. She would be handling the preparation process. "What preparation process?" Claire said. "You will need to understand the family," Ms. O said. "Their customs, their expectations, how to address the grandmother, what you can and cannot say at the table, what questions you will be asked, and what answers have been agreed upon." "Agreed upon by who?" A brief pause. "By Mr. Kang and yourself, at whatever point you meet to discuss the parameters." "I haven't agreed to anything yet." Another pause, slightly longer. Mr. Kang was under an impression, Claire said. "Tell him I need to meet with him first, in a public place. and I need the full picture before I agree to anything, including what exactly you mean by agreed-upon answers." The silence on the other end of the line had a texture to it, not hostility, something closer to recalibration. "I'll convey that," Ms. O said. "Expect a call this afternoon." The call that afternoon was not Ms. O. It was Seojin himself, which she hadn't expected, and the lack of preamble, so no greeting, just his voice, direct and level, picking up mid-thought, was somehow already familiar in a way that irritated her slightly. "Coffee," he said. "There's a place in Mangwon. I'll text you the address. 2:00. "I have work at 4. "Then 2:00 works." She opened her mouth to push back on the presumption in that, and then closed it, because the fact was that 2:00 did work, and arguing with accurate information to demonstrate independence was a waste of both their time. 2:00, she said, and hung up first. The cafe in Mangwon was small and warm, and the kind of deliberately ordinary that people with too much money sometimes gravitate toward when they want the experience of not being noticed. He was already there when she arrived, in jeans and a dark sweater, the absence of the suit somehow making him look no less formal. He'd chosen a table against the back wall. He was drinking Americano and reading something on his phone with the focused disinterest of someone who was, in fact, very interested, but had trained himself not to show it. He didn't stand when she sat. She didn't expect him to. She ordered coffee from the server without looking at the menu and turned to face him. "Parameters," she said. He put his phone down. Face up this time, she noticed. Different from the restaurant. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with why you actually need this." He considered her. Then, without the particular performance of reluctance she might have expected, the theatrical hesitation of someone used to not explaining themselves, he simply told her, his grandmother, Madame Kang Hyun, 74 years old, the only person in the family whose opinion about anything had ever mattered to him. She had been asking, with increasing frequency over the past year, when he intended to marry, not because she was traditional in a rigid way, but because she was old and she knew it and she wanted, before she was too old to enjoy it, to see him choose something other than work and control and the specific loneliness of being a man people feared. He had, over the past 3 years, brought 2 women to family functions. Both had been exactly what you'd expect from women who knew who he was before they met him. Composed, strategically warm, calibrated to impress. His grandmother had been polite to both of them and afterward had told him, with the serene honesty of a woman who has passed the age of softening necessary truths, that both women were auditioning for a role and that he should stop wasting everyone's time with auditions. "She said she wants to meet someone real," he said. He held his cup without drinking from it. "Someone who doesn't know how to want something from me." "I know how to want the money," Claire said. "Yes," he said. "But that's an honest want. That's different." She turned that over. He was right, and she resented that he was right, because being right about something like that implied a level of perception that complicated her ability to keep this transaction simple. "One dinner," she said. "One dinner. I need the backstory, whatever we've supposedly told her about how we met, how long, all of it. We met at my restaurant. You work there. The timeline is 6 weeks." He said it without consulting anything, which meant he'd already built the story without her input, which she noted. The details of how it developed are vague. Vague is more believable than specific. "That's actually true," she said despite herself. "I know. You need to stop doing that." He looked at her. "Doing what?" "Being right." Something moved in his face, not the laugh from the restaurant, something quieter than that. A shift. "The dinner is in 3 weeks," he said. "Ms. O will meet with you twice before then. She'll cover everything you need to know about the family, the estate, the customs at the table, how to address my grandmother. My grandmother will speak to you in Korean and English both. She was a professor. She'll expect directness, not performance." "I told you I can't perform." "I remember." He finally drank from his cup. That's still the point. The 2 preparation sessions with Miss So took place in a small office in Seongsu-dong that had the deliberate blankness of a room that was used for exactly this kind of thing and nothing else. Neutral walls, a round table, a whiteboard that Miss O used with the quiet authority of a woman who had prepared people for difficult rooms before. She was maybe 50, with the kind of posture that suggested she had never once in her life been caught off guard. She walked Claire through the Kang family structure with the systematic precision of someone briefing a very important deposition. Seo Jin's parents were deceased, his father 12 years ago, his mother 8. He had one living uncle, Kang Myung-soo, who was his father's younger brother, and who currently oversaw the family's construction interests. He had 2 cousins through that uncle, both in their early 30s, both male, both present at family dinners. "The uncle," Ms. O said. "What do you notice when I say his name?" Claire looked at her. "You said it differently." "Did I?" "Slightly, like you were handling it carefully." Miss O looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "He will be the most difficult person in the room. He has his own reasons for being invested in Mr. Kang's personal choices. You don't need to understand those reasons fully. You simply need to know that anything he says to you will have a secondary purpose behind it." "Is he dangerous?" "Everyone in that family is dangerous," Miss O said, in a tone so level it functioned as its own kind of warning. "Some of them just show it differently." Claire wrote that down in the small notebook she'd bought for this, then looked up. "What about the grandmother? What does she actually care about?" Miss O paused. When she spoke again, something in her voice had shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softer exactly, but less structured. "Madame Kang is the reason the family still has anything resembling a conscience. She is very sharp, very patient. She will ask you about your mother. She will ask you what you want from your life. Not from Seo Jin, from your life. She will listen to how you answer more than she listens to what you say." A pause. "Don't be impressive. Just be honest." "People keep telling me that," Claire said. "Perhaps because it's difficult," Ms. O said, and moved on to the next item on the whiteboard. The Kang estate was 40 minutes outside Seoul, in the foothills of the Bukhansan Range, accessed by a private road through pine trees that Claire registered as beautiful in the distracted way she registered things when she was managing a significant internal situation. Seo Jin had sent a car. He was already at the estate. The car was driven by a man who did not speak once during the entire 40-minute ride, which Claire had actually been grateful for, because she'd used those 40 minutes to run through everything Miss O had covered, and to be honest with herself about the fact that her hands were cold inside the gloves she was wearing, and not because of the November temperature. The estate was not what she'd expected, or maybe it was exactly what she'd expected, and the problem was that expectation didn't help. It was large, built in a blend of traditional and contemporary architecture, the kind of place that communicated wealth through restraint rather than excess. Clean lines, careful gardens, the kind of silence that comes from being surrounded by enough land that the city can't reach you. Seo Jin met her at the entrance. He was in a dark suit. He looked at her once, a quick, assessing look that cataloged the dark green dress she'd spent 40 minutes deliberating over, and the fact that she'd put her hair up in the particular set of her jaw, and said, "You look fine." "Thanks. That's the most reassuring thing anyone has ever said to me." "Would you prefer a lie?" "No," she admitted. "Let's go." He walked beside her through the front entrance, and she noticed that he didn't touch her. Not her arm, not the small of her back, nothing. And she couldn't decide if that was considerate or a form of distance, and either way she didn't ask. They had agreed on enough. They hadn't agreed on a performance. The family was already gathered in the main sitting room. She felt them before she saw them, the specific pressurized quality of a room full of people who have been waiting for you and have formed opinions before you arrived. Kang Myung-soo, the uncle, was standing near the window. He was heavier than Seo Jin, broader, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something that still expected to be treated as handsome. His sons flanked him at a distance, one leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, the other sitting with a posture that communicated boredom so precisely it had to be strategic. 3 or 4 other relatives Claire didn't have names for yet were distributed around the room with the careful spacing of people trying not to look like they're watching the door. And then Madame Kang-hyun rose from her chair. She was small. That was the first thing. And then you adjusted for it and saw past it to what was actually there. which was a woman of 74 with the posture of someone who had never found it necessary to make herself larger, because her presence already filled the room from its natural size. Her hair was white and gathered precisely. She was dressed in deep burgundy, simply cut. Her eyes were black and completely awake. She looked at Claire with the particular attention of someone who sees, not assesses, not judges, but actually sees. And then she said something in Korean that Claire caught about 60% of, which was enough to get the structure, if not every word. Seo-jin translated. She says you look like someone who has been somewhere difficult and came through it without deciding it made you hard. Claire looked at the old woman. Tell her she's giving me more credit than I deserve. Seo-jin translated. Madame Kang listened, and then she smiled, not politely, actually, and she said something shorter. She says that's exactly what she means, Seo-jin said. Dinner was served in a formal dining room where the table was long enough to seat 12 and currently seated 9, and the food arrived in the traditional sequence, the banchan first, then the main dishes carried by 2 staff who moved like they'd been doing this since before Claire was born. The conversation was multilingual in the chaotic, overlapping way of large family gatherings, Korean dominant but English surfacing in pockets, and Claire navigated it the way she navigated the restaurant floor. Stay aware, stay level, don't guess what you don't know. It was Myung-soo who came at her first. He waited until the second course, until she'd had just enough food and enough conversation to possibly be lulled. Then, from across the table, with a smile that had been assembled from component parts that didn't quite fit each other. So, Claire, you're a waitress. She looked at him. Yes? At Seo-jin's restaurant. The smile. Convenient. I thought so too, she said pleasantly. He's never dated staff before. He reached for his glass. To his credit. The table shifted. 2 of the relatives found something interesting to look at on their plates. Seo-jin, beside her, was entirely still. That quality of stillness she was starting to understand was not calm, but its exact opposite, compressed. He still hasn't, Claire said. We met at the restaurant. I don't think that's the same thing. Myung-soo's smile didn't change. Of course not. Forgive me. I just wonder... He paused with the performance of a man pretending to search for words he had prepared in advance. What it is exactly that you 2 have in common, given the difference in backgrounds. Myung-soo, Seo-jin said. One word. The sound of a door closing. I'm just asking the questions the family is thinking, Myung-soo said, with a warmth that did not reach anything above his mouth. Then the family can ask them directly, Claire said, and she looked around the table without aggression, just clarity, and I'll answer. I'm not embarrassed about where I come from. I'm from Bakersfield, California. My mother's a retired school teacher. I'm here because I needed work, and I found it. I met Seo-jin because I work in his restaurant, and he came in one evening and we talked, and... She paused. And this part she hadn't planned, but she felt the room waiting, and she chose to give it something true rather than something constructed. And he was the first person in this city who talked to me like what I said was worth hearing. That's what we have in common. If that's not enough of an answer, I'm happy to sit here until you think of a better question. The table was quiet. Madame Kang, from the head of the table, said something soft in Korean. Seo-jin didn't translate immediately. She looked at him. He was looking at his grandmother. Something moved between them across the table that had nothing to do with words. Then he turned to Claire. His voice was very quiet. She says you're the first one he's brought here who looked at the room before sitting down. Claire didn't fully understand that, but something in the way the old woman was watching her made her feel, for the first time in 4 months of Seoul, like she was in a room she could breathe in, which was precisely when Myung-soo's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it quickly, the kind of glance men give phones when the message is expected and unwelcome in equal measure. And something in his face rearranged itself, so quickly that Claire only caught it because she was already watching him. He looked up. He looked at Claire. And then he looked at Seo-jin. And the look was not the look of a man across a family dinner table. It was something else. Something that had been in the room all along, she understood, waiting for the right moment to show itself. She pressed her knee very slightly against the edge of the table, a steadying reflex, and smiled at something one of the cousins was saying. and filed that look away in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be returned to later. Because she understood, with the specific animal clarity of a woman who had spent 8 years reading rooms for a living, that whatever Myung-soo had just read on his phone and whatever it had done to the expression on his face in that half second before he controlled it had something to do with her. She just didn't know yet what it meant. She would. Soon. And by then, the door she had thought she could still walk back through would already be gone. The drive back to Seoul took 40 minutes and neither of them spoke for the first 20. Claire sat on her side of the back seat with her hands in her lap and watched the pine trees give way to highway and thought about Myung-soo's face, the way it had shifted, the speed of it. She'd spent 8 years reading the micro-expressions of customers who were about to complain, who were about to ask for something unreasonable, who were about to make her night difficult, and she'd developed a vocabulary for those shifts, the tightening around the eyes, the way the jaw resets when a person's internal calculation changes. What she'd seen on Myung-soo's face across the dinner table was in that same category but heavier, more specific. "Your uncle," she said. "What's his actual position in the family?" Seo-jin didn't look away from his window. "He manages construction." "That's his title." I asked his position. A pause. The highway lights strobed through the glass at regular intervals. "He wanted to lead the family," Seo-jin said, "when my father died. He believed it should have passed to him. But it didn't. I was 26. My father had been preparing me since I was 15. There was no ambiguity in the transition." He said this without satisfaction. Just fact. Myung-soo accepted it. Did he? Seo-jin turned from the window then and looked at her with an attention that was different from the previous times, sharper, with less of the composed neutrality that was his default register. "What did you see?" She told him. The glance at the phone, the fraction of a second before the control came back down, the specific quality of the look he'd aimed at Seo-jin afterward, which had not been the look of a disappointed relative, but something with edges in it. Seo-jin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as always, level, unhurried, but she was starting to understand that level and unhurried were not the same as unaffected. "You're certain?" "I read people for a living," she said. "I'm certain of what I saw. I don't know what it means." He looked forward again. He took out his phone, typed a brief message, and put it away. The motion was contained and final, like closing a door. "I'll look into it," he said. "Should I be concerned?" He considered the question with what seemed like genuine seriousness. "Not tonight." That was not a no. She filed it next to the look on Myung-soo's face and went back to watching the highway. She slept badly and woke at 5:30 with the particular unease of someone whose brain has been working while the rest of them rested. The apartment was still dark. The refrigerator was still humming its pained hum. She lay there for a few minutes identifying the source of the unease and then got up and made coffee and called her mother. Dorothy picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. They talked for 22 minutes. Her mother's hip had been worse this week. The physical therapist had recommended a new treatment that the insurance was reviewing. The word reviewing in this context meant denying until proven otherwise. Claire had heard this before. The arithmetic was always the same. New expense, same income, same gap. "I'm handling it," Claire said. "You always say that." "I always handle it." "I know you do, baby." Her mother's voice had the particular texture of exhaustion and love mixed together in proportions that couldn't be separated. "I just don't want you handling it alone." "I'm not alone," Claire said, and then paused at the strangeness of that answer, because she'd said it automatically, and it had come out more true than she'd intended, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. After the call, she sat at her small table with her second cup of coffee and looked at her notebook, the one she'd been keeping since the Miss O sessions, full of names and protocols and things to remember it, and thought about the Kang family estate, the way Madame Kang had looked at her across the table, the warmth of the sitting room, the smell of the food, the chaotic multilingual overlap of the dinner conversation that had felt, in some way she hadn't expected, like the specific noise of a family rather than a performance of one. She thought about what it would mean if the dinner had been the end of it. Take the money, close the notebook, go back to the restaurant, and the 7-minute shower and the monthly calls and the gap that never quite closed. She thought about that for a long time. She didn't feel better at the end of it. So Jin called at 9. Can you meet this morning? I have work at noon. Before noon. He sent the address, not the cafe in Mangwon this time, but an office building in Yeouido, clean glass and gray stone, the kind of building that contained very serious things done in very quiet ways. She took the subway and found the floor he'd specified and was shown into a conference room by a young assistant who offered her water twice with the anxious precision of someone who had been told to make this particular guest comfortable and understood the weight behind the instruction. Seo Jin was in the room with 2 other men she hadn't seen before, both in suits, both with the particular quality of absolute stillness that she was starting to recognize as a professional characteristic among the people who worked directly for him. He didn't introduce them. He looked at her when she came in and said, "The phone Myung-soo checked at dinner. We pulled the number." A pause. "It belongs to a company registered in Busan. The company is a shell. The people behind the shell are associates of the Shin organization." She sat down. "Who are the Shin organization?" "The family that has been trying to take our distribution network for 7 years." He said it with the same flat informational quality. 3 attempts in that time, 2 directed at operations, 1 directed at me personally. He paused. None of them successful. She processed this. "So your uncle is in contact with a rival criminal organization?" "Yes." "Since when?" "We don't know yet. Long enough that they knew you were coming to the dinner tonight before you arrived." The room was very quiet. "They knew about me," she said. "They knew someone would be there. Someone new. Someone important enough to be brought to the estate." He was watching her with that total attention quality. "They don't know specifically who you are. They know you exist. Which makes me useful to them. As leverage." "Yes." He paused. "That is why you should have been concerned last night, and I apologize for telling you otherwise." She looked at him for a moment. The apology was so plainly not something he said often that it arrived with its own particular weight. She didn't acknowledge it directly. "What does this mean for the arrangement?" she said. "The arrangement," he started. "I did what you hired me to do," she said. "One dinner. That was the agreement. Whatever is happening with your uncle and whatever organization he's working with, that's not something I signed up for, and I think we both know that." He was quiet. "I have the money," she said. "I'm grateful for it. I genuinely am. But if my presence is now a security concern for you and a potential target situation for me, then the practical thing, my grandmother asked to see you again." She stopped. He said it without inflection, not as a manipulation, just as a fact being placed on the table for her consideration, the way he placed everything, with the expectation that she would deal with it honestly. "When?" she said. "She called me this morning. She wants you to come to the estate for lunch next week." He paused. "She doesn't do this. She has never asked to see any—" He chose the next word carefully. "Anyone I've brought to the family." Claire looked at the 2 men in suits who were looking at nothing in particular with extraordinary focus. She looked at the water glass the assistant had brought her. She looked at the conference table's surface, which was clean enough to reflect the ceiling lights in a long pale streak. "What aren't you telling me?" she said. The silence lasted 3 seconds. In her experience, the length of a silence before an answer was proportional to the size of what the answer contained. "My grandmother is ill," he said. "She was diagnosed 8 months ago, terminal. She has, the doctors estimate 6 months, perhaps 8. He stopped. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, still. "She has known since the diagnosis that the time is limited. She has been putting things in order, the family, the estate. Things she wants to see resolved before—" He stopped again. Claire understood then what she was to this man. Not a transaction. Or not only that. She was something he'd reached for in a moment of genuine desperation, trying to give an old woman dying of cancer one thing she'd asked for. To see her grandson choose something real. "She liked you," he said. "That is not a small thing." Seo Jin. His name, first time she'd used it directly. He registered it, a slight shift in his attention. "How sick is she? Right now? Today?" "She tires easily. She's in pain that the medication manages but doesn't eliminate. She has good days." He looked at the table. She had a good day today. She called me herself. Claire thought about her mother's voice at 5:30 in the morning, the hip, the insurance, the word reviewing. She thought about Madame Kang rising from her chair in that sitting room with the posture of a woman who had not yet permitted her body to dictate terms to her dignity. "One lunch," she said. Something in him shifted. Almost nothing, but she was watching closely enough. "And then we figure out the rest as it comes," she said. "But I need you to be straight with me about the security situation. If I'm a target because I showed up at your family dinner, I need to know exactly what that means in practical terms. I need to know if someone is following me. I need to know if my apartment is—" "There's already a detail on you," he said. "Since this morning." She stared at him. "Since this, 2 people. You won't see them. You don't need to interact with them, but they're there. You put a security detail on me without asking me." "Yes." "That's not—" she started, and then stopped, because the argument she was about to make, about consent, about autonomy, about the basic principle that people should be informed when they're being followed, ran directly into the counter-argument that she was apparently being watched by people connected to a criminal organization, and that being angry about protective surveillance was a particular kind of privilege she didn't currently have access to. She breathed out slowly through her nose. "We're going to have a conversation about decisions that affect me being made without me." "Yes," he said. "We are. Later." "Later," he agreed. Later did not come before things got worse. It was 4 days after the dinner. She was working the lunch shift at Huanso Grill. It was quieter at lunch. A different crowd. Business clients and the occasional tourist, the pace manageable. When a man sat in her section she didn't recognize. Nothing immediately alarming. He ordered well, spoke Korean, ate without incident. She brought him his bill. He paid. And as she was clearing the table, she found, beneath the folded receipt, a photograph. It was small. Printed on plain paper, the kind of low-quality print you'd get from a convenience store machine. It showed Claire outside her apartment building in Mapogu, taken from across the street, time-stamped 3 days ago at 7:14 in the evening. She was in her coat, carrying groceries, looking down at her phone. She stood at the table with the photograph in her hand and felt a specific, cold, clarifying kind of fear move through her body. Not the hot spike of adrenaline fear of immediate threat. The slower, more durable fear of understanding that you have been observed, cataloged, filed, that someone has been watching you in your ordinary life and you had no idea. She went to the kitchen. She went to the back hallway. She took out her phone and called the number Seo Jin had put in her contacts the morning of the Yeouido meeting. He picked up on the second ring. "Someone was in the restaurant," she said. Her voice was very steady. She focused on keeping it that way. "He left a photograph under his receipt, me outside my apartment, 3 days ago." The silence on his end lasted 1 second. "Are you still in the restaurant?" "Kitchen." "Stay there. Do not go back on the floor. Someone will be there in 8 minutes." "Sojin, 8 minutes. Do not leave the building." The line closed. She stood in the kitchen hallway with her back against the wall and the photograph in her hand, and she looked at the image of herself. So ordinary, so completely unaware, groceries and phone and the oblivious privacy of a person who thinks they are alone. And something hard and cold settled into her chest and stayed there. The man who'd arrived in 7 minutes was one of the suits from Yeouido. He didn't give his name. He collected the photograph in a small evidence bag he produced from his jacket pocket, which told her this was not the first time this kind of thing had required this kind of bag. He asked her 3 questions. What the man looked like, what he ordered, how he paid. Then he looked at her with the specific blankness of a professional who has delivered bad news so many times the delivery has become procedure and said, "You'll be moving tonight." "Moving," she said. "Your apartment. You'll be relocated tonight. Pack what you need. Mr. Kang has arranged something more suitable." "He's arranged," she started. "Miss Whitmore." He said her name the way people say names when they want you to understand that the discussion portion of the conversation is concluded. "The photograph means they've been tracking you for at least 72 hours. Your current address is compromised. You can be angry about the logistics later. Tonight you need to move." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the refrigerator with the pained hum, the 7-minute shower, the window that looked at a concrete wall. She thought about the fact that she'd been sending money home to her mother from a compromised address for 4 days without knowing it. "Does this put my family in the States at any risk?" she said. Something moved in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. "No, their interest is in pressure points that affect Mr. Kang directly. Your family is too far removed to be a practical lever." That's the most unsettling professional reassurance I've ever received. He didn't respond to that. He handed her a card with a new address. 7 o'clock tonight. Leave normally. Take your usual subway route. We'll handle the transition from there. He left. She went back on the floor and finished her shift because what else was there to do? And she carried plates and cleared tables and said the right things to customers. And the whole time, the weight in her chest stayed exactly where it was, solid and cold and completely unwilling to be managed down into something smaller than it was. The new apartment was in Yongsan, 4th floor elevator, a door with a security pad, windows that looked at actual sky. It was 3 times the size of her Mapo Gu place and furnished with the deliberate neutrality of somewhere that has been arranged quickly by people with access to good resources and no personal investment in the aesthetic result. It was clean. It was warm. The refrigerator, when she opened it, was stocked. Not elaborately, just practically, the kind of stocking that said someone had thought about what a person needed for a week rather than what would impress them. She stood in the middle of the living room with her carry-on at her feet and the overhead light filling everything with a bright, impersonal clarity, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt furious. Not at Seo Jin exactly. Not at any one thing. At the totality of it. The way a decision she'd made to solve a specific bounded financial problem had expanded, without her consent, into something that now had security teams and relocated apartments and photographs taken outside her building. At the way the control she'd maintained over her own situation, the careful, constant, exhausting management of a life that had always required active management, had been circumvented by forces she hadn't seen coming and couldn't have, because she hadn't known what she was walking into, despite being told she would have the full picture. She called Seo Jin. He answered immediately. "You told me full picture," she said. "Before I agreed to anything. That was the condition." "Yes." "The full picture didn't include me being photographed outside my apartment by people connected to a rival organization 4 days after one dinner." "No," he said, "it didn't." "Because you didn't know?" A pause. "Because I underestimated how quickly Myung-soo would move." "How long have you known your uncle was working against you?" "I've had suspicions for 4 months. Evident since last night." She pressed her hand flat against the wall of the new apartment and felt the paint, smooth and impersonal. 4 months. "Yes." "And you brought me into this family situation while you had 4 months of suspicion about someone inside the family. I didn't believe you would be visible enough to become a target. One dinner with a woman I'd met." "But that's not what it was," she said, and her voice came out harder than she'd planned. "You knew what your grandmother meant to you. You knew that if she reacted to me the way she did, it would register. You knew Myung-soo watches everything at those dinners. You knew all of that, and you calculated the risk, and you decided it was acceptable. And the thing you calculated the risk for was not me. It was the picture you wanted your grandmother to have before she died." The silence this time was longer. "Yes," he said, flat, no defense in it. She breathed, once, twice. "I want an actual full accounting," she said. "Everything, not the version you decide I need to know. The version that is true. I want to understand the shape of what I'm inside right now because I can't make good decisions without an accurate map, and you have been giving me a tourist version." "That's fair," he said. "I know it's fair. I'm not asking for your opinion on its fairness. I'm telling you what I need." Another pause. "Come to the Yoido office tomorrow morning. I'll have Junho and my security lead both present. You'll hear everything." 8 o'clock, she said. 8 o'clock. She hung up. She stood in the middle of the bright, impersonal living room for another minute. Then she unzipped her carry-on and started unpacking, because she was practical and she was tired and the anger would still be there in the morning, and she needed to eat something and find out if the shower in this place operated on the same punishing 7-minute schedule as the last one. It didn't. The water ran hot for as long as she stood under it, and she stood there for a long time, long past the point where standing there accomplished anything, just letting the heat work on the cold weight in her chest until the two things reached some kind of equilibrium. She was not afraid of hard situations. She had never had the luxury of being afraid of hard situations. But she understood, standing in that shower in the new apartment in Yongsan with the photograph still sitting in an evidence bag somewhere in this city, that the thing she'd walked into was not the thing she'd agreed to walk into, and that the distance between those two things was exactly the distance she would need to cross if she was going to survive this. Not intact, maybe, not unchanged, but upright. And she intended to be upright. The question that hadn't been answered yet was what being upright was going to cost her, and who else, before this was finished, was going to pay part of that bill without having agreed to it either, because Madame Kang was in that estate with a man who was betraying her family. And she was 74 years old and running out of months, and nobody had told her that either. Claire turned off the shower, stood in the steam, and made the decision that would make every subsequent decision inevitable. She was going to the Yoido office at 8 in the morning, and she was going to get the real map, and she was going to use it, not to find the exit, but to figure out what needed to be done before she could leave in good conscience. She didn't know yet that good conscience, in this situation, was going to require her to become someone she had never needed to be before. The 8 o'clock meeting at Yoido lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Claire understood the shape of things in a way that made the previous weeks feel like she'd been reading a map held upside down. Seojin's security lead was a man named Han Dong-wook, compact, 50s, the kind of face that had stopped being expressive sometime in the previous decade and hadn't found a reason to start again. He spoke in Korean, and Seojin translated with the flat efficiency of someone who had heard all of it before and was providing the translation as a courtesy rather than a necessity. Mizo sat in the corner with a notebook and said nothing and wrote everything. The Shin organization had been making moves on Kang distribution routes for 7 years. 3 direct confrontations, all absorbed. What had changed 8 months ago? What Han had been tracking and Seojin had been monitoring with increasing concern was the shift in strategy. They'd stopped coming at the operation directly. They'd started looking for internal leverage instead. And Kang Myung-soo, who had spent 15 years watching his nephew run the family he believed should have been his, had at some point made a calculation about the ratio between loyalty and opportunity and reached a conclusion that had been wrong for both of them in different ways. "How deep?" Claire asked. Han answered. Seojin translated. He's been feeding them operational information for approximately 5 months. Route schedules, personnel movements, the structure of the security rotations around the estate. A pause. He told them about the dinner before it happened, not just that a woman would be present. He told them her name. Claire was quiet for a moment. He found out my name before the dinner. Yes. How? He has access to restaurant HR records, Junho's staff files. Seojin's voice didn't change. He knew who you were before you walked through the front door. She thought about the dinner. Myung-soo's smile. The specific architecture of his questions. Not hostile enough to be dismissed, not warm enough to be trusted. The way he'd looked at her like he was confirming something rather than discovering it. He was assessing me, she said. At the dinner, deciding how useful I was. Yes? And then he called them from the table. She remembered the phone buzz, the fractional shift in his face. He was confirming I'd arrived. Han said something. Seojin translated. The communication from the dinner triggered a secondary action. The Shin organization activated surveillance on you the following morning. The photograph at the restaurant was a message. They wanted us to know they had access to you, that you were reachable. The word reachable sat in the room with its own particular gravity. What do they want? She said. Han spoke. Seojin was quiet for 3 seconds before he translated, and she understood from those 3 seconds that this was the part he hadn't wanted to get to. They want a meeting with me, a negotiation on terms for the distribution routes. They want me to come alone. Their leverage to compel this. He stopped, started again. Is you. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. So they're going to use me to get to you, she said. That's the current read of the situation. And if you don't comply, a silence. Seo Jin, if you don't comply with their demand for a meeting. He looked up. His face was what it always was, composed, controlled, the architectural stillness. But underneath it, something was working, something under pressure, and she could see it the way you can see movement through ice. They escalate. In these situations, escalation means, don't translate that into something softer than it is. A beat. They take someone to demonstrate that the threat is real. The room was quiet. Han looked at his notebook. Ms. O wrote something. When? Claire said. We don't know. The photograph was sent 2 days ago. In our experience with how the Shin organization operates, the window between demonstration and action is 72 hours maximum. He paused. We have until tomorrow night. She did the arithmetic. It was 8:43 in the morning. Okay, she said. Everyone in the room looked at her. What's the plan? She said. The plan had 3 components, and all 3 made her stomach hurt in different ways. The first was that she would continue her normal routine today. Restaurant, apartment, the visible, trackable movements of a person who didn't know the clock was running. This was necessary because if she disappeared from her pattern now, it would signal to the Shin organization that their message had prompted defensive action rather than compliance, which would accelerate their timeline unpredictably. The second was that Han's team would use her visible routine to map the surveillance on her, identify the people, the vehicles, the communication patterns, to build a comprehensive picture of the Shin operation's current local infrastructure. The third was that Seo Jin would make contact with Myung-soo. Not to confront him, Seo Jin said, preempting the question she was about to ask. To contain him. If he knows we're aware of the arrangement, he warns them. We need him in the estate and not communicating until the operation is complete. How do you contain your own uncle without tipping him off? I invite him to a family meeting at the estate tonight, something routine enough that he won't question it. And once he's there, he stays there. She thought about Madame Kang in the estate, about the old woman with the white hair and the burgundy dress who had looked at her across a dinner table with the full, undivided attention of someone who still found people genuinely interesting. Does your grandmother know any of this? No. She's in that building with a man who is... I know, he said. His voice came out harder than she'd heard it, not at her. I know, the estate security is being quietly reinforced as of this morning. She is not at risk. You sound very certain. Because I am. He looked at her directly. She will not be harmed. I promise you that. She held his look for a moment. She didn't tell him she believed him, because belief wasn't the transaction. Reliability was, and she'd spend the rest of the day finding out how reliable that promise was. I want updates, she said. Every 2 hours, if anything changes. Every 2 hours, he said. She stood, put her jacket on, picked up her bag. I'm going to go be a visible target in my normal routine now, she said. That's a sentence I didn't anticipate saying at any point in my life. Han said something. Seo Jin translated. He says you're handling this well. Tell him I'm handling it exactly as badly as it deserves, and I've just had a lot of practice keeping that internal. She left. The lunch shift was both the longest and most procedurally normal 4 hours she'd spent in months. She carried plates. She explained cuts of meat. She smiled at customers and refilled water glasses and processed the ordinary human texture of a busy restaurant, while somewhere in her peripheral awareness, 2 people she couldn't identify tracked her movements through the room and relayed information to Han Dong-wook's team, and the whole thing operated with the seamless invisibility of something she'd been told was there but couldn't see. Seo Jin texted at 2 o'clock. 2 words. Myung-soo confirmed. He was going to the estate that evening. She sent back, Grandmother? His reply took 4 minutes. Long for him. She's having a good day. She asked if you would visit soon. She stood in the back hallway with her phone and breathed once, deliberately, through the tightness in her chest. Tell her yes, she typed back, then went back on the floor. It happened at 4:17 in the 20 minutes between the end of her shift, and the moment she would have been inside the subway station and therefore significantly harder to access in the way they apparently intended. She'd taken the long route. Han's team had suggested it, more visible, more mappable, a street with better sightlines for their surveillance of the surveillance. She was on the second block when the van pulled to the curb 20 feet ahead of her. She knew what it was before the doors opened. Some part of her had been calibrated for this since 8 o'clock that morning, and the specific way the vehicle stopped, too close to the curb, too quickly, the side door already moving, bypassed the part of her brain that needed to analyze and went straight to the part that had already made decisions. She turned and ran. Not the blind, panicked run of someone who has stopped thinking, the focused, directional run of someone who has been told exactly where to go if this happens. Left at the corner, Han's voice from the morning briefing. Left at the corner, there's a covered market. You go in, you don't stop, and you don't look back. You get to the center, and you stop moving. She heard footsteps behind her. 2 sets. Gaining. She turned left, hit the market entrance at full speed and went through it. The stalls on both sides, the narrow channels between them, the smell of fish and sesame, and the startled sounds of vendors as she came through at a run that wasn't casual. She cut right between 2 stalls. Left again. She could hear 1 set of footsteps, not 2. She'd lost one of them in the turn, or they'd split and gone around, and either option was bad in a different way. She stopped in the center of the market, the way Han had told her, and pulled out her phone, and her hands were not steady, and she noticed that without being distracted by it, a tremor, just a physical fact. She'd been running, and her blood was going, and her hands were not steady, and that was fine. She called Han's direct number. He picked up before the first ring completed. "Center of the market," she said. "1 behind me, maybe 1 coming from the east entrance." "We see you. Do not move. 30 seconds." She put her back against a support column and faced the direction she'd come from. Around her, the market had gone to a particular kind of alert stillness, people sensing something without knowing what, the subtle animal awareness of a situation that has moved outside normal parameters. An older woman at the nearest stall had pulled back slightly. A man 3 stalls down had stopped whatever he was doing and was watching the entrance she'd come through. The man who'd been behind her appeared in the channel between the stalls. He was young, broad, moving with the controlled speed of someone who did this professionally and hadn't yet had a day where it didn't work out for them. He saw her. He didn't run. He walked, which was actually worse, because it meant he wasn't panicked and wasn't concerned about witnesses. He was still 8 feet away when 2 men came from her left and 1 from her right at a speed that was efficient and total, and the young man had exactly 1 second to register what was happening before Han's people were on him in a way that didn't involve shouting or drawn weapons or any of the theatrical signals of conflict. Just controlled, applied force, and the abrupt termination of his forward motion and a hand over his mouth before sound became an option. It was over in 4 seconds. Another of Han's team appeared at her elbow. "There's a car at the south exit. Can you walk?" Her legs were fine. Her hands had stopped shaking. "Yes." "Walk normally." She walked normally. The debrief happened in a room she hadn't been in before. Smaller than the Yeouido conference room. No windows. The kind of functional blankness that exists in buildings specifically maintained for situations that couldn't be resolved in ordinary places. Han was there. Seo Jin arrived 11 minutes after her, still in his jacket from the estate, and the specific quality of his stillness when he walked in and saw her sitting at the table was different from all previous qualities of his stillness. She registered it without commenting on it. "The second man?" Han said. Seo Jin translated automatically. "He got out. We have a partial description. He was the communication relay. He would have messaged back that the acquisition failed." "Which means they know you intercepted the attempt," Claire said. "Yes. Which changes their timeline. They'll move faster now, and differently." Sojin's voice was level, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the pressure behind the ice. "They know our surveillance identified their people. They'll recalculate the exposure." "Which means they'll go for something bigger, faster," she said, "before you can reposition." Han spoke. Long, this time. When Seo Jin translated, his voice was quieter. "The man we took in the market has been talking. The Shin organization has a secondary plan. If the direct acquisition of you was disrupted, which it was, they go to the contingency. The contingency is not you. He paused. It's the estate. The word estate landed in the room with the weight of everything it contained. Your grandmother, Claire said. The estate staff. The family. The building itself. He looked at her. Myung-soo has already given them the security rotation schedule. The team he gave it to has been operating on it. They know there's a window, 40 minutes, starting at 10 p.m., when the transition between the evening and overnight teams creates a gap. What time is it? 8:51. She did the arithmetic. 69 minutes. The reinforcement you put in this morning, she said. Is it enough? For a standard incursion. This isn't a standard incursion. If Myung-soo gave them the layout as well as the rotations, he stopped. Is your grandmother somewhere defensible in the estate? Her rooms are on the second floor. Interior corridor. No direct exterior access. Can she be moved? Moving her means telling her something is wrong. In her condition, Seo-jin. She said his name the way she'd been learning to say it. Not a question, a direction. We do not protect her from knowing something is wrong if knowing it is the thing that keeps her safe. She is 74 years old and she has terminal cancer, and the one thing I am certain about her from the 4 hours I have spent in her presence is that she is not fragile. Don't make her fragile to make yourself feel better. He looked at her. The muscle in his jaw moved once. Then he took out his phone. He spoke to whoever picked up for 40 seconds in Korean, too fast for her to follow. And when he ended the call, his face had settled into something new. Not the controlled composure of his default register, but something harder and more specific. The face of someone who has made a decision that has no version where everything is fine. Han's team moves on the estate in 40 minutes, he said. I go in with them. You go in with... She started. I know the layout better than anyone here. That's not the point. If something happens to you, nothing happens to me. He said it with a flatness that communicated not confidence, but intention. The specific quality of a man who has decided outcomes by force of will, often enough to believe he can continue doing it. I need you to stay here. Absolutely not. Claire, your grandmother is in that building and I told her I would visit, and I am not sitting in a windowless room while you're a target. If they see you at the estate, it gives them, then they see me. I know the estate layout too. I know where her rooms are. I can reach her faster than anyone on Han's team because I've been there and I know which hallways she uses and where she sits in the evenings. She stood up. I'm not furniture in this situation. You said yourself that what you needed was someone who simply is. I'm here. Let me be here. The room was very quiet. Han was looking at neither of them with great concentration. Seo-jin looked at her for a long moment. The pressure behind the ice was visible now, fully, for the first time. Not in his expression exactly, but in the quality of his attention, which had lost the last of its distance and was just present. Directly and completely present, looking at her like she was the fixed point in a room that was otherwise in motion. Stay with Han's people at all times, he said. You do not go anywhere alone. Agreed. If the situation exceeds the parameters, I'll do what I'm told. You have never once done what you were told. I'll start tonight, she said. It's a special occasion. He held her look for one more second. Something crossed his face. Not the small exhale from the restaurant, not the measured consideration of the cafe, but something rawer and more unguarded than either of those. Something that arrived and was gone before she could fully read it, but that she understood nonetheless, with the same instinct that had told her in the market to turn left, with the same clarity that didn't require analysis. Then Han was moving, and people were gathering equipment, and radios were clicking, and the room went from still to operational in the space of 15 seconds. And Claire picked up her jacket and followed, because there was no other direction left, and she had stopped pretending, somewhere in the last 69 minutes, that there ever had been. The van that carried them toward the Bukhansan foothills moved through the Seoul night with its lights normal and its speed unremarkable, and inside it 7 people sat in the dark without speaking, checking equipment in the efficient silence of professionals who have run out of the kind of time that allows for anything other than what comes next. and Claire sat in the middle of them with her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing controlled and the image of Madame Kang rising from her chair, small, precise, the posture that refused to negotiate with limitation, fixed in her mind like a compass point, and she held on to it as the city fell away behind them and the pine trees closed around the road ahead, and somewhere in the darkness of the estate, the clock was still running and the window was still closing, and everything that had been moving toward this moment since the night she'd picked up a ceramic dish in a restaurant and changed the entire direction of her life was about to arrive at once, without mercy, in the next 40 minutes. The pine trees along the private road were black shapes against a darker sky, and the van moved through them without headlights for the last quarter mile, running on the driver's knowledge of the road and the faint ambient glow from the estate walls ahead. Claire felt the darkness as a physical thing pressing against the windows. Beside her, Han Dong-wook was reviewing something on a tablet with the screen turned low, its light catching the angles of his face in pale fragments. Seo Jin sat across from her, and she could not see his expression clearly, but she could see the set of his shoulders, which told her enough. The van stopped 200 meters from the gate. Everyone moved without being told to. Han's team deployed in pairs, 2 to the east perimeter, 2 to circle the service entrance on the north side, 1 to hold the vehicle. Han himself took the direct approach, the main gate, with the specific confidence of a man who had authorization codes current as of that morning and intended to use that window before it closed. Seo Jin went with him. Claire stayed 1 step behind Seo Jin because that was the arrangement, and she intended to honor it for as long as honoring it remained rational. The gate opened. The estate grounds were lit at their perimeter, but the interior gardens were in the softer, lower light of the decorative fixtures, warm pools of amber on the stone paths, shadow between them. The estate house itself showed lights on the ground floor and a single window lit on the second floor, the interior corridor where Madame Kang's rooms were. That light was the first thing Claire looked for. She found it and kept finding it, checking back every 30 seconds, a compass. Han spoke into his radio, low and fast. Seo Jin translated in an undertone as they moved. 2 of the Shin people are already inside the perimeter. East Garden, near the auxiliary building. Han's East team is moving to intercept. A pause. The security rotation gap opened 6 minutes ago. They came in during the first 4 minutes. How many total? Unknown. Estimate 4 to 6. The estate has how many staff on site tonight? 6 staff. 4 dedicated security, the 2 who are currently on shift. He paused. And Myung-soo. They were crossing the main garden now, on the stone path, moving fast but not running. Running was sound. Sound was information given to the wrong people. Claire's shoes were wrong for this. Low heels she'd worn to the restaurant that morning in another life, and she felt each uneven stone through the thin soles and didn't adjust her pace. From the east side of the estate came a sound that was short and conclusive. Not a gunshot, something more contained, and then a series of rapid exchanges she couldn't identify. And then nothing. Han's radio clicked twice. He said something brief. Turned to Seo Jin. 2 down on the east side, Seo Jin said quietly. Detained. Radio's taken. That means the others don't know the east approach is gone. How many left? At least 2, probably inside. They reached the main entrance. The door was not forced. The lock showed no damage, which meant someone with a key or a code had opened it. Myung-soo. He'd let them in, or left the means to enter, and he was somewhere in this building right now with the knowledge of what he'd enabled and the specific moral architecture of a man who had been building justifications for 15 years. Han went first, then Seo Jin, then Claire, and the warmth of the interior hit her after the November cold, and for one disorienting second it smelled like the dinner. The specific blend of wood smoke and something floral, and the deeper, older smell of a house that had been inhabited long enough to have its own atmosphere. And then she was past that and following Seo Jin through the entrance hall toward the stairs. They heard it before they reached the staircase, a voice from the ground floor sitting room, the room where the family had gathered for the dinner, the room with the long table and the careful lighting. A voice she recognized. Myung-soo, speaking in Korean at a register just below a shout, the contained fury of a man making an argument he has been rehearsing in his head for a long time. and another voice, answering him, older, quieter, absolutely steady. Madame Kang. Seojin stopped moving. Claire nearly walked into him. She felt him go rigid through the inch of air between them, every muscle in his body receiving the same memo simultaneously. He turned to Han and said something in a whisper so tight it was almost no sound at all. Han nodded and moved right, toward the exterior approach to the room. Seojin moved left. Claire followed Seojin because the decision was instantaneous and complete, and she was not going to stand in a hallway. They came to the sitting room door from the corridor side. It was open 2 inches. Through the gap, Claire saw the room reassembled in the wrong configuration. The furniture pushed back, or moved, or maybe just the difference between a room at dinner and a room at 9:30 at night with its terrible particular furniture of confrontation. Madame Kang was in her chair. Not the formal dining chair from the dinner, but the lower cushioned chair by the far wall, the one that suggested this was where she actually sat in the evenings, the one that was hers in the real way that daily habits make things yours. She was in her nightrobe and her white hair was down, and she looked in the low lamp light, both smaller than she had at dinner and somehow not diminished by the smallness. Myung-soo was standing in the center of the room. He was still in his jacket from whatever meeting or pretense had brought him to the estate that evening, and his face had the flushed, over-controlled look of a man who has been managing a very large emotion for a very long time and is running out of the capacity to manage it. 2 men Claire didn't know stood near the far doorway. Shin organization, she understood immediately. The ones who'd come in through the unlocked entrance and found their way here, and the specific way they were positioned communicated that this was not what had been planned. Something had already gone sideways. One of them had a phone out, trying to raise the East team, she realized. Getting nothing. Myung-soo was speaking to his mother's mother. No, his brother's mother. Seojin's father's mother. The matriarch. The woman who had presided over this family since before any of them had known what kind of family they were becoming. And his voice had the quality of a man who had wanted to say something for a long time and had chosen the worst possible moment to finally say it, which was the kind of decision that revealed, Claire thought, exactly what you were made of when the structure fell away. He was telling her that Seojin had taken what should have been his, that the family had chosen wrong, that he had spent 15 years in service of a man who had never seen him as anything other than a subordinate, and he had tried to correct the balance, and the people he had worked with to correct it were here now, and the plan had been, his voice shifted, the plan had been simply to demonstrate that Seojin's control was not absolute, that there were vulnerabilities, that a negotiation was necessary. Madame Kang let him finish. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on him, and she let him speak until the words ran out, which they did eventually, the way the words of people who have been waiting too long to say something always do. They run fast and then faster, and then they hit the end of what was prepared and stumble into the silence of what was never planned. Then she spoke. Claire didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. She was telling him that she had known. Not everything, but enough. That old women who have spent their lives in rooms where men discuss things they believe old women can't hear develop a particular fluency in the language of what isn't said. That she had watched him for 2 years accumulating his grievance like a man collecting wood for a fire he intended to use. And she had hoped she was wrong, and she had not been wrong. And the grief of that was something she would carry, and he did not need to explain it to her. Then she said something short and final. Seojin made a sound beside her in the corridor. Almost nothing, just an exhale. And Claire looked at him, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before. The composure was intact, but what was behind it was not under pressure anymore. It had broken through. And what was on his face was grief, clean and direct, the kind that doesn't negotiate. She put her hand on his arm, just her hand on his forearm, through the fabric of his jacket. He didn't look at her, but he didn't move away. Han's signal came through the radio. 1 click, meaning positioned. And Seojin looked at her, and she took her hand back, and he pushed the door open. The room reorganized itself around the new information of their presence. The 2 Shin men reached the conclusion that the East team's silence had been trying to tell them, and made the adaptive decisions of people who understand that the situation has become something other than what they arrived for. One of them moved toward the far door and found Han coming through it, and that avenue closed. The other assessed the geometry of the room and made the calculation that the geometry didn't favor him and stood still, which was the first intelligent thing anyone on the Shin side had done all evening. Myung-soo looked at Seo-jin. The room was silent in the specific way of a room where everyone has stopped pretending. Seo-jin crossed it. He didn't hurry, and he didn't hesitate, and he walked past the Shin men like they were furniture, which told Claire something about his assessment of their remaining threat, and he stopped in front of Myung-soo and looked at him. Just looked at him. The two men stood in the lamplight of the sitting room where the family had eaten together for 30 years, and Seo-jin looked at his uncle with the face of a man who was reading the last page of something he had hoped would end differently. Myung-soo's jaw was tight. The flush had receded from his face, leaving it flat and gray-toned in the way of a man whose adrenaline has concluded its business and left him with only what was always there underneath. "Say what you're going to say," Myung-soo said. In English, Claire realized, directed at the room that included her, perhaps aimed at her in some final, stubborn performance of having been wronged. "There's nothing to say," Seo-jin said. "You're going to leave. Tonight. The business transitions are already being drafted. You'll be compensated for your stake, and you won't contact the family again." He paused. "That's not a negotiation. You can't—" "The alternative," Seo-jin said, his voice dropping into a register that did not rise or fall or accommodate argument, "is that I let Han document everything you've done and pass it to people who will find it very interesting. Your choice. Make it now." Myung-soo's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Madame Kang, perhaps for the last time, understanding that whatever appeal he might have made there was already finished, that she had already said everything she intended to say, and that the woman sitting in her chair with her hands in her lap and her eyes on him was not going to intervene in either direction, because she had placed herself outside the specific argument between two men about power and allowed it to conclude on its own terms. He looked back at Seo-jin, and something in him, not collapsed, not broken, but conclusively done, the way a door is done when the key is turned for the last time, went quiet. He walked out. Han's men followed him. The two Shin operatives were taken out through the service corridor with the efficient minimalism that characterized everything Han's team did, and then the room was very quiet, and Seo-jin turned to his grandmother, and Claire took 3 steps back to give him what he needed, which was the space to be a grandson and not the person he'd had to be for the last 45 minutes. She sat on the arm of a chair near the doorway and watched him cross the room and crouch down in front of Madame Kang's chair, a movement so uncharacteristic of everything she'd seen from him that it arrived with its own kind of impact, this large, controlled, self-sufficient man folding himself down to eye level with an old woman in a robe, and take both of her hands in both of his. Madame Kang looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, across the room, to Claire. She said something. Seo-jin turned his head and looked at Claire too. "She says," he said, and his voice was different from every other version of his voice she'd encountered, stripped of its professional quality, just the voice underneath, "that you came." Claire looked at the old woman. "Of course I came." Madame Kang said something else, shorter. A small smile moved across her face, the real kind, the kind that comes from a place too far down to be performed. "She says," Seo-jin said, "that's exactly what she told him you would do." Claire sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up and crossed the room and pulled up a small footstool near the old woman's chair and sat on it, close, and took one of Madame Kang's hands, the one Seo-jin wasn't holding, and held it. The hand was thin. The bones moved under the skin like something constructed from the finest available materials by someone who had known they'd need to last a long time. Warm, though. Very warm. They sat like that for a while without anyone saying anything, and outside the estate the pine trees stood in the dark, and somewhere on the grounds Han's team was concluding its business with the quiet efficiency of men who cleaned up difficult situations and left no record of the cleaning, and the clock that had been running down all evening had at some point, without any single moment announcing it, simply stopped. The weeks that followed did not resolve into simplicity. That was not how things worked, and all 3 of them, Seo-jin, Claire, the old woman in the room on the second floor, were people with enough accumulated experience to understand that. Complexity did not exit cleanly. It deposited sediment. The Shin organization, deprived of its internal asset and with 3 operatives in Han Dong-wook's custody and their leverage operation publicly failed, retreated into the specific silence of an organization recalibrating. Han's assessment was that they would not move again on the Kang infrastructure for at least a year. Seo-jin received this information without visible relief, which Claire understood. A year was not a resolution. It was a pause. You managed pauses and you built better structures in them, and you remained clear-eyed about what you were managing. Myung-soo's departure from the family business was processed through lawyers and accountants over 3 weeks and generated paperwork that would have looked, to anyone not familiar with the context, like an ordinary corporate restructuring. He left Seoul. Claire didn't ask where he went and wasn't told, and she made peace with not knowing because knowing would not change anything, and she had learned, in the past months, to be selective about what she carried. She kept working at the restaurant. Park Joon-ho had been informed of enough of the situation to explain the security team that had briefly occupied his back corridor and had responded with the resolute professionalism of a man who had worked for the Kang family long enough to understand that some events were acknowledged and not discussed, and he had never once adjusted the way he spoke to her at work, which she respected deeply. She visited the estate twice a week. This had not been negotiated or formally established. It had simply become true, the way some things become true. Incrementally, each visit making the next one more natural until the pattern was indistinguishable from intention. She took the same car, the same route, the same 40 minutes through pine trees, and she arrived and was met at the door by staff who knew her by name and had stopped bowing at a depth that communicated uncertainty and now bowed at the moderate depth of people who had categorized her correctly. Madame Kang was better on some days and not better on others. That was the nature of terminal illness. It did not progress like a story, building toward its conclusion in a legible arc. It surged and receded. There were afternoons in the estate garden where the old woman walked the stone paths at a pace that suggested years still remaining. And there were mornings. Claire wasn't always there for these, but Seo-jin told her, because he had begun telling her things without being asked, which was its own kind of event. When she didn't leave her rooms until noon, and the medication had to be adjusted, and the doctor visited. On the good days, they cooked together. This had been Madame Kang's suggestion, arriving in the 3rd week as a straightforward domestic proposal. She wished to show Claire how to make doenjang jigae the way she'd made it for her husband, which was apparently distinct from every other way it was made and had been the subject of some family debate for decades. Claire had accepted without the self-consciousness of someone who understood they were being absorbed into something. She'd just accepted, and she'd stood in the large estate kitchen in an apron that was too short for her, following instructions in Korean that she caught at 80% and filled in the remaining 20 with context, and the result had been, honestly, remarkable. Deep and complex and warm in a way that went beyond the technical, the way some food carries the intention of the person who made it in a manner that can't be entirely explained by the recipe. Madame Kang had watched her eat the first bowl she'd made independently and said something, and Seo-jin, who had been sitting at the kitchen table reading something and pretending not to watch, had translated without looking up from his reading. She says you eat like someone who knows food is not guaranteed. Claire had thought about her mother's kitchen in Bakersfield, the way Dorothy stretched a grocery budget across a week with the specific creativity of someone who had been doing it for years. The particular triumph of a meal that was both good and economical. Tell her she's right, Claire had said. Madame Kang had said something else, to Seo-jin this time, still looking at Claire. He'd looked up from his reading. His expression had done the thing it did now occasionally. The slight softening at the outer edges of his composure, like a window that has been painted shut for years being opened by someone patient. He hadn't translated immediately. Then, she says that's why you'll do. Claire had looked at the old woman. Do for what? Madame Kang had smiled and taken another piece of food and not answered, and Seo-jin had gone back to his reading, and the kitchen had been warm and full of the smell of the soup, and outside the estate's kitchen window, the November garden had been gray and precise and very still. She told her mother in December. Not everything. She told Dorothy about the arrangement, and she told her about Madame Kang, And she told her about the estate and the cooking and the visits, and she told her carefully that the situation had become more complicated than a single dinner, but that she was safe and that she paused at the word, testing it, she was okay, which was a thing she didn't always say honestly and was saying honestly now. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, then, is he a good man? The question arrived with its particular weight. Claire thought about Seojin at the dinner table and in the Yoido conference room, and in the van moving through the dark toward the estate. She thought about him crouching in front of his grandmother's chair and holding her hands in the lamplight of a sitting room full of the aftermath of everything that had tried to destroy them. He's trying to be, she said. I think that counts. It counts for a lot, baby, her mother said. Trying is most of it. She sent more money home that month. Not from the original payment that had gone to Dorothy's medical debt and the medication reserve exactly as planned. This was from the restaurant, the regular wages, which had been supplemented quietly and without discussion by a revision in her pay structure that she'd discovered in her bank account and that she and Park Junho had not discussed, and that she intended to address at some point and had not yet addressed because the amount was material. And her mother's hip didn't care about the ethical complexity. She was working on being imperfect without letting it expand into something larger. That was the ongoing project. So Jin came to the restaurant one Thursday in early December. Not to the table, not in the way of the first night, the command performance at the corner with 50 witnesses. He came in at a slow hour in the late afternoon, sat at the bar where Junho set up occasional solo diners, and ordered simply, and when Claire came by, he didn't treat it as anything other than what it was, which was a man who had come to a restaurant where someone he knew worked because he wanted to be somewhere she was. She brought him water. He said thank you. She went back to her section. He stayed for an hour. When she passed his bar seat on her way to the kitchen, he said without preamble, I've been thinking about the distribution structure. Okay, she said, still moving. I want to divest the components that require, he chose the word with care, the kind of management that Han's team provides. She stopped, turned, looked at him. He was looking at his glass. All of it? She said. Not all. The legitimate operations are substantial on their own. The family has construction interests, logistics, 2 manufacturing facilities. It's enough. He paused. It's more than enough. That's a significant restructuring. Yes. People will read it as weakness. Some people. He looked up at her. The people whose opinion matters to the legitimate operation will read it as a signal that the business is clarifying its terms, which it is. She looked at him for a moment. What made you decide? He was quiet. I've been carrying something that I took over from people who made choices before I had the option to choose differently. He stopped, and she could see him working through the articulation with the care of someone not accustomed to saying things like this out loud. Managing a legacy rather than building something. He looked at his glass again. I'd rather build something. She understood that this was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, possibly to anyone, in the way that practical statements can be the most personal, when what you're really describing is not a business decision, but an interior rearrangement that has been a long time coming and that required specific conditions before it was possible. Okay, she said. He looked at her. That's it? What do you want me to say? I don't know. He picked up his glass. Something. I think it's the right decision, she said. I think you've known it's the right decision and you needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to evaluate it in terms of what it cost the operation. And I think, she paused, I think your grandmother is going to be very glad to hear it. Something shifted in his face. The window again, that quality of the composure opening rather than breaking, which was a different thing entirely, and she had come to understand was his version of the most significant form of trust. I'll tell her Sunday, he said. Will you be there Sunday? Yes, she said. She went back to her section. From across the restaurant, she could see him finish his water and set the glass down and sit with his hands flat on the bar counter in the contained, still way that was simply how he existed in rooms, and there was something about the sight of him, a man who had spent his entire adult life as the fixed point around which everything else moved, sitting alone at a bar in a restaurant at 4 in the afternoon like a person, that made her chest feel like something had shifted position inside it, something that had been braced against weight it no longer needed to resist. She picked up a tray of drinks for table 9 and kept moving. Madame Kang died on a Tuesday in late February, at 6:30 in the morning, in her room on the second floor of the estate. Seo Jin was with her. Claire had been there the night before and had left at 10, and she had held the old woman's hand in the corridor outside her room and said goodnight, and Madame Kang had looked at her with the full, clear-eyed attention that had been one of her unchanging qualities, the willingness to look at things directly without flinching, and had said something in Korean. Claire had understood it without translation. She'd learned enough. She understood it, and she'd nodded once, and the old woman had nodded back, and that had been the last thing between them. So Jin called her at 7:15. She was already awake. She'd slept poorly in the way of someone whose body knows something before the phone call confirms it. She didn't say anything when she answered. Neither did he, for a moment. Then, she went quietly, while I was talking to her. What were you talking about? A pause. His voice was very quiet. Not broken. He was not a man who broke in the audible sense, but stripped. In the way she'd heard it in the sitting room after Myung-gu left, the professional quality gone, and just the person underneath. The restaurant, he said. The night you slapped a man in my restaurant. She pressed her hand flat against the wall of her apartment in Yongsan. The paint was smooth and cool under her palm. She liked that story. She asked me to tell it every week for the last month, a sound that was almost a breath. She said it was the best thing I'd done. Claire looked out her window at the Seoul sky, which was the flat, pale gray of a winter morning, and she did not try to manage what she was feeling into something more orderly than it was. She let it be the size it was. That was something Madame Kang had shown her, not in instruction, just in presence, the practice of allowing things to be the size they were. I'll come, she said. You don't have to. I'll come, she said again, in the tone that finished that particular conversation. She hung up. She stood at the window for a few more minutes. Then she changed her clothes, called a car, and went. The estate in February was different from November. The garden bare, the stone paths clear, the pine trees on the perimeter unchanging because pines don't perform the seasons the way other trees do. They were simply there, dark and constant, and Claire walked through them on the path from the main gate to the door and felt the cold of the morning and the particular silence of a house where something irrevocable has just happened. She stayed for 3 days. She didn't plan to stay 3 days. She had her carry-on from the night before, and then she stayed and one of the staff brought her things from the apartment, and the days organized themselves around what was needed. Practical tasks, calls to arrange, the specific domestic labor of a household absorbing a significant absence, which required hands and presence and the willingness to be in a room without knowing what to say, which turned out to be more useful than knowing. Seo Jin moved through those 3 days with the contained efficiency that was his default mechanism for grief, which was to work, to handle, to organize. And Claire recognized it as not avoidance, but simply the shape of how someone manages pain when they've spent a lifetime as the person responsible for what happens next. She didn't push him toward anything different. She made food and answered the door when people came and sat beside him in the evenings when he ran out of things to organize and the house was too quiet. On the 3rd evening, they sat in the estate garden after dark, on the stone bench near the east wall where Madame Kang's rose bushes waited for spring, in their bare and patient way. It was cold. Neither of them mentioned it. She left you something, he said, not looking at her, looking at the dark shape of the rose bushes. In her estate planning, she did it 3 weeks ago. Claire looked at the side of his face. What? A letter, primarily, and a standing instruction that you were to be given access to the estate gardens whenever you wished, which is the kind of thing she did when she decided something about a person. What does the letter say? He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, handed it to her. She could see her name on it in the precise, unhurried handwriting she recognized from the single note she'd once received on estate stationery, confirming a lunch date. Just her first name, Claire. She held it in both hands. Did you read it? It's addressed to you. She held it for another moment, then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written in English that was formal and exact and unmistakably hers. The English of a woman who had been a professor and chose her words with the precision of someone who understood that words were not decorative. Claire read it slowly, once, in the dark, her phone's light illuminating the pages. Madame Kang wrote about her first impression at the dinner, the specific observation that Claire had looked at the room before sitting, which she had explained to Seo Jin that night, but elaborated on here, that she had seen, in that gesture, someone who had learned to assess environments before committing herself to them, which was the gesture of a person who had not always been safe and had adapted to it without bitterness. She wrote that this was rare, that bitterness was the more common adaptation and the less useful one. She wrote about the cooking lessons, about the way Claire ate with honest appetite, which was a thing the old woman had spent years watching people suppress in her presence out of performed delicacy, and which she had found in Claire entirely absent. She wrote, "You ate like someone who does not apologize for needing things, which I found immediately correct." She wrote on the second page about Seo Jin. She wrote about watching him in the kitchen on the Sunday when he'd sat at the table pretending to read. She wrote that she had watched him watch Claire, and she had seen something she had stopped expecting to see, not desire, which she had observed in him before in its usual forms, but attention, the kind that doesn't calculate. She wrote, "He looked at you the way people look at things they are afraid of losing, and he didn't know he was doing it, and that was the thing that told me." She wrote, at the bottom of the second page, in smaller print, as though this were a note added after the main letter was complete, "I am not asking you to stay. I am telling you that the garden is yours because you are the kind of person who tends things, and this garden has needed tending for a long time. Whatever you decide about the rest of it, the garden is yours. That is my decision, not his. Come back to it sometimes." Claire folded the pages, put them back in the envelope, held the envelope in both hands and looked at the dark rose bushes and the cold February sky. "She says the garden is mine," she said. "I know." He was still looking at the rose bushes. "She told me when she updated the estate plan." "She told you." "She said, and I'm translating accurately, that you would need somewhere to go that wasn't about me and that the garden qualified." Claire laughed. It came out abruptly, the way laughter does when it arrives in the middle of grief. Not because anything is funny, but because the person who caused it was so specifically, characteristically themselves, that there's no other response. She pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed through it, and then lowered her hand and sat with the laugh and the grief together. "She was right," Claire said. "She usually was. What are you going to do? Going forward?" He was quiet for a moment. His breath was visible in the cold, small clouds forming and dispersing. "The restructuring is moving. 2 of the legacy operations are in negotiation with buyers. The legitimate holdings are being reorganized under a new structure, cleaner, auditable, the kind of thing that can survive scrutiny." He paused. "It will take a year, possibly 2. And then? And then I'll have a business that I built rather than inherited." He looked at her. "That's the plan." She looked back at him, at the face that she had spent 4 months learning to read, in the way you learn to read something that doesn't advertise itself, that requires sustained attention, that reveals itself incrementally to people willing to look past the composed surface to what was actually there, which was, she had concluded, a man in genuine conflict with the life he'd been handed and the person he wanted to become, and who was, imperfectly and with considerable difficulty, choosing the latter. "My mother wants to come to Seoul," she said. "She's been talking about it since I told her about the cooking lessons." She paused. "Her hip is doing better. The new treatment worked." "When?" he said. "Spring, maybe, when the rose bushes are—" She gestured at the bare branches. "They bloom in April," he said. "Early April if the winter was mild. Then April." He nodded, looked at the garden. She watched his profile in the dark and thought about a woman who had been dying and had spent her last months ensuring, with the quiet, systematic determination of someone who understood that time was a finite resource and should be allocated accordingly, that the people she was leaving behind had what they needed. Who had written a letter and assigned a garden and told the truth to her grandson's face about a man she'd loved her whole life and found efficient in the end, and had done it all from a chair in a sitting room in a robe with her hands in her lap and her white hair down and her eyes completely clear. She was remarkable, Claire said. Yes, he said. They sat in the cold for a while longer, not talking. The pine trees on the perimeter were very still. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, Seoul continued its enormous, indifferent movement. The subway lines running, the restaurants operating, the million overlapping ordinary urgencies of a city that doesn't pause for private griefs. And inside the walls, in the cold garden in February, two imperfect people sat with their grief and their particular histories and the specific strange path that had brought them both here. A slap in a restaurant, a photograph under a receipt, a ceramic dish of sauce set on the wrong table, and they did not try to resolve any of it into something smaller than it was. They let it be large. They let it take up the space it needed. Claire looked up at the pale Seoul sky. She thought about her mother in Bakersfield, sleeping, probably, the bad hip finding a bearable position. She thought about April, about rose bushes blooming in a garden that was now, by the deliberate decision of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing, hers. She thought about the 7-minute shower in the Mapogu apartment, and the refrigerator with the pained hum, and a carry-on with 4 changes of clothes and $32, and a cocktail napkin with a name on it, and the particular desperation of a person who has run out of options that don't involve risk. She thought about how none of those things had changed, and all of them had changed, and how the difference between those two facts was not a paradox, but just the way time actually worked, if you were willing to move through it without turning back. "Seo-jin," she said. He looked at her. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything that needed saying that hadn't already been said in the accumulated language of the last 4 months. The kitchens and the conference rooms and the vans moving through the dark and the stone bench in the garden and the hand she'd placed on his arm in a corridor when the composure had broken through to what was underneath. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the garden. But he moved, very slightly, until his shoulder was against hers. And they sat like that, in the cold, in the dark, in the garden that was now hers, while the February sky held its gray patience above them and the rose bushes waited, bare and ready, for April.